He's going to be in the public eye in the years ahead, and you need to get acquainted with him. In 1953, I went to the South Dakota legislature as a freshman legislator. There were about 19 of us that year went in as freshmen in our particular party, and one of them was Bob Chamberlain, a young, aggressive, and progressive farmer from Hecla, South Dakota, who quickly moved to be minority leader in the South Dakota legislature, in the House of Representatives, and went on to serve for 3 or 4 additional terms with distinction and with rare ability. And I'm not saying this to build up a speaker, I'm saying it from my heart. You're going to hear a gentleman this afternoon who has rare ability as a legislator, as a thinker, and someone that you're going to be seeing around quite a lot in the future. Bob Chamberlain came within an eyelash of being Lieutenant Governor of the state of South Dakota at the last election. And it's my real privilege now to present my personal friend and your friend, Robert Chamberlain from Hecla.
Mr. Radcliffe, Herman Peets, with whom I served, and you most patient ladies and gentlemen, I assume that following the announcement that a Brown County dirt farmer would substitute for a United States Senator, that there was something of an exodus for the nearest exits, and believe me, I don't blame you a bit. And may I express my admiration for your patience and your endurance that you have and will exhibit here before this afternoon is over. To let you know how well prepared I am, I was informed last night at 10 o'clock that I was to substitute for Senator McGovern. You've heard of the perennial substitute, I'm sure. He may be the bachelor in the neighborhood who is always available for some social function when the host or hostess has some unencumbered young lady who is looking for a husband. He sometimes is the pinch hitter on a baseball team who is not good enough at the plate to be in the regular lineup, but is called upon sometimes daily to produce as a substitute for a batter who is supposed to be good enough to be in there daily, and he's expected to get a hit. He may be the number 2 quarterback on a professional football team who never plays, but who is paid a handsome salary to sit on the bench each Sunday in the event the number 1 man gets hurt. Well, now, I don't get paid for my substitution, but this is not the first time that I've served in this capacity, and I'm beginning to feel like that perennial substitute who's always around, but who never quite makes it to the starting lineup. Now, I have substituted for George McGovern before, for state legislators, for mayors who are too timid to give welcoming speeches at city functions, for congressmen. And to show you that I'm nonpartisan, I even substituted one time for Republican Governor Joe Foss. I don't want to identify myself politically, but I can tell you right now I don't belong to the same party as Mr. Foss. I received a most unusual introduction on that occasion. The superintendent of the school is a very fine gentleman who's become a personal friend of mine since, called me about 10 days in advance and advised me that Governor Foss, who had been announced as commencement speaker, was going to Europe to tour military installations. And therefore would I substitute for him, and I agreed to do so, and very happy. That evening at an assembly that outnumbered this by a considerable amount, the superintendent in his introduction admitted that he had waited until just 10 days before to seek a substitute and replacement for Governor Foss. And Quentin said he had called a speaker's bureau and asked him whom they could send in Joe Foss's place. And he said the head of the bureau asked him how much money he could pay. And Quentin Miles said, well, this is a small school, we're not very wealthy, we can pay 25 bucks. And the head of the Speaker's Bureau said, at this late date and for 25 bucks you can't get much, how about Bob Chamberlain? Well, I gave him a $5 speech, took my $25 and got out of there, I can tell you that. This has been something of a hectic last 10 days for me. I was one of the fortunate few to come up with World Series tickets. And feeling that a good baseball game is more educational than any daily school routine, I took my youngsters to Metropolitan Stadium and saw the only two good games the Twins played, by the way. I was home for a few hours and came right back to this city for an early morning board of directors meeting for an insurance company. Was home just a few hours and gone again. Now, my wife accompanies me on most of these affairs, and by 10 o'clock last night, she was a bit weary and seemed to be coming down with what we describe in my household as the sniffles. So I told her that I thought both of us should resort to an old-fashioned remedy, the medicinal effects of which have long been discredited, but a potion that still, to me, tastes much better than any medicine I could get. So I mixed up a couple, you know. About 2 ounces of the amber fluid and lots of hot water and some lemon juice and sugar. And when Mrs. Chamberlain got through with it, she went in to kiss our small son goodnight, and he whispered in her ear, and he says, Mama, does Daddy know you're using his mouthwash? Has anybody ever stepped up to you and asked you what your occupation was, and when you said, I'm a farmer, they look at you and say, well, you don't look like a farmer? I just happened to me not long ago. I stopped to help out a lady in distress. She had a flat tire and obviously didn't know how to use the bumper jack. And then when I got through with that, I found out, in addition to this, and this seems incredible, but it's true, she was out of gas and couldn't make it to town. And she wanted to know if I'd go into town and send a tow car or a station attendant out with a gallon of gasoline or so. And I said, it's unnecessary. I have gas right here in my pickup, in the pickup unit. And she said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a farmer. And I was pumping gas into her tank, and she said, you don't look like a farmer. And I said, Madam, would you please tell me how a farmer is supposed to look? Now, I said, I don't have manure on my boots today, but I often do, and the wife doesn't object when I walk in on the wall-to-wall carpeting because she says it has the smell of money. I don't have straw sticking out of my ears because we're all done combining. I don't happen to have jeans with patches on today, but I do have some at home. How is a farmer supposed to look? Well, when I got home and related this little incident to my wife, she said, did she recognize you? And I said, no, because she asked me my name. And Jane said, you didn't tell her, did you? And I said, yes, I told her I was Bob Chamberlain. And she said, well, you sure blew that one. Well, I said, maybe I blew it, and I won't get her vote next time, but at least I got something off my chest that's bothered me for a long time. How does a farmer look? To some Easterners, you know, you are people who drive about on superhighways in super Cadillacs. Each one of you has a swimming pool back home. You have both hands out to the federal government. You complain constantly because you don't get enough. You seek direct subsidies all the time. You're responsible for the high cost of foods in the supermarkets, in the shopping centers, in the major cities of the United States. You're a hayseed. You're naive. All these things are supposed to typify a farmer. Now, in speaking with George McGovern last night, he told me, and I have here a prepared statement from him, that the Farm Bill, which has been adopted by Congress, is the best in 2 decades. And it occurred to me when he told me that maybe for the first time in a couple of decades, there are some people in the cities who are beginning to understand the importance of a healthy farm economy in the United States. Through the election of 1948, we had what we called a farm bloc. And after that election, it seemed to disappear. And people began to get some strange ideas about what the farmer should have and what he sought. And the farm bloc in Congress disappeared and lost its power, and we got nothing much in the way of farm programs. So maybe for the first time in years, those cliff dwellers of the city the people who engage daily in what I call freeway frivolity, that's that bumper-to-bumper and fender-to-fender clashing that they do twice daily, once on the way to work and once on the way home. If you've never been on it, I had a friend that went out to Los Angeles last year and swears up and down that this is true. He was trying to find the Long Beach exit, got in the wrong lane and ran out of gas and was on the freeway for 30 minutes before anybody knew it because they just kept pushing him along. Now, these people have some odd ideas about those of us out here who till the soil, and I think maybe for the first time we've seen some expression of solidarity in Congress, some expression of a desire to do something to restore the farmer to his rightful role. Now, why this occurred, I'm not sure. Maybe it's because they started reading. And they don't have to read the agricultural yearbook. They don't have to read Ray Fitzgerald's report on Commodity Credit Corporation holdings. They don't have to consult state-by-state statistics on crops produced, livestock in the feedlot, breeding cattle in the pasture. They don't need to fill their minds with facts and figures. All they have to do is pick up one good American history book, and they'll find out the true story of American agriculture. For you see, the ills that have beset us out here for a long time aren't anything new. They go clear back to the Civil War. It was right after the Civil War when Congress, induced largely by the railroads who had built out here and wanted some settlement, adopted 4 acts aimed at getting you people, your forebears, to come out here and farm what had been described before as the great American desert and what now they described in glowing terms as the breadbasket of the nation. And so you could, for $1.12.5 an acre, acquire 2 complete sections. Now, this is before the time of ACP, of ASC, of wheat quotas, of diesel monsters with 85 horsepower, of 16-inch bottom plows, of 18-foot tandem discs on transports, of hybrids, of agricultural experiment stations, of research, of extension agents, all these things with which we're familiar. This was just the good old prairie in Dakota Territory, in Kansas, in Minnesota, and in Montana, and they walked behind the plow, pulled by the horse or the oxen, turning the soil. And yet they were able to, by 1887, produce 1/3 more wheat than domestic consumption required. And so the 1/3 extra was exported to Europe. And it was well that it had been, because European capital had been invested in the United States in those years, the capital necessary to foment the Industrial Revolution which occurred then, and if it hadn't have been for the wheat grown out in this area, to pay for the interest on that capital investment, European money would have stopped its flow to the United States. Yet, even with that export business, the price of wheat started to decline, and it went down to 62 cents in 1887, when the then wheat farmer said we must have at least $1 or we can't make it. Now, he's not buying $8,700 tractors and $1,500 plows and $2,000 press drills. He's still walking behind that plow. Well, to add to his woes, another old familiar trouble came along: 5 years of continuous drought. And in spite of the fact that the drought dried up a great share of the production, there was still too much wheat. And some of the weaker souls left, you know. They had come out here in covered wagons with great hopes, signs plastered on Dakota Territory or bust, or I'm on my way to Montana, and they went back with different signs in the same Conestoga wagon. One such sign, history records, said 50 miles to water, and this was in Dakota Territory, 50 miles to water, 100 miles to wood, to hell with this country, I'm going home for good. And down below, somebody had written in, going back to my wife's folks. This sounds a little familiar too, doesn't it? Going back to my wife's folks. And so they left. And actually, by 1900, the agricultural population out here was less than it was in 1887. And a further oddity is that in 1900, it was almost as great as it is today, 65 years later. So a great many of them gave up and never came back. Well, then the farmers who were left, the hardy souls, took the next step that we all take. We took it last June. They got a rural farm lobby and started a long, arduous trip to Washington, D.C. for help. And they got a tariff program on imports, and the net result was as it always has been. The price of everything the farmer bought went up, and the price of wheat and everything else kept right on going down. And the only respite they got was World War I. And after World War I, right back into the depths again. And there are among us today farmers who belong to another organization, and perhaps even some who are in this, who say, we don't need any government program. We want no intervention by the federal government. We want to be rugged, free individualists. Now, these are the same people that got all excited 2 years ago because we got up to 102 million cattle and livestock prices were depressed, and they said, we got to stop imports. So they went back to Washington and asked for increased tariffs. Now, this is not a subsidy, you see, in their mind. These are the same rugged individualists who every time they get an extra heavy snowfall out in the western part of this or some other state, call on the Air National Guard to kick out bales of hay to feed the livestock so they can be bailed out of the trouble. And they regard this, of course, as a natural day-by-day operation of the Air National Guard, which ought to be airlifting hay all the time anyway. But you see, this is not government intervention. This is something different. Well, I don't have to relate what happened in the 30s to you. There are a great many of you here who remember it all too vividly. And so when somebody walks up to me and says, you don't look like a farmer, you might well ask the same question, what does a farmer look like? I'll tell you what I think he looks like, knowing what I do about it after a number of years. He looks like a man who ought to be wearing so many different hats that if he put them all on his head at the same time, he would look like an animated leaning tower of Pisa. Why? Well, in the first place, you're a money manager now, or you better be when you go to your banker and talk about a loan for a new tractor. And once you've spoken in his terms and done it well enough to get the loan at a rate of interest, thank goodness, that's not like the 20% that they charged back in those 1880s, you have to be enough of a trader to go to your farm equipment dealer and get a halfway decent deal on your tractor. So you put on a second hat, haven't you? Now, when you get the thing, you have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to read the operating manual to start the thing and get it going down the field. I do anyway. It's gotten too complicated for me. So you've got another hat. And then you've got to be a hydraulic engineer to operate all the controls on it because they've changed all that since I started. And then you have to be a mechanic to fix it if it breaks down. And I'll tell you something you really got to be when you go buy the part. You got to be a fellow that's not addicted to ulcers and has a rugged constitution, because when you look at the repair bill, it'll knock the props right off from underneath you. So you've got another hat, haven't you? How much do you have to know? Well, really, with all these hats, a Lily Daché should design a new one for you. You'd be a good object lesson for her. You see, besides knowing seeds and fertilizers and equipment, you've got to know fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, insecticides, Republican sides, and Democratic sides. You've got to be able to recognize vibriosis, leptospirosis, brucellosis, atrophic rhinitis, and bursitis, which you'll end up with before the season is over. You've got to know hybrids, fungus, blight. You've got to be able to recognize tax collectors when they come around, revenuers if you farm in Arkansas or Missouri, the banker when he shows up because you're a day too late on the note. You've got to be able to recognize foot rot, root rot, corn borers, cornworms, and a host of other things about which the city dweller never has heard. So when you get all through, you're a million things to a million different people. We remind, all of us, I'm reminded of Lon Chaney in the movies, The Man with a Million Faces. And you've got them all and maybe a couple more. Now, if you're all these things, you ought to assume your rightful place in American society today. And you shouldn't assume the role of that hayseed that the city dweller likes to envision us as. Now, there are a few of you who are better managers who are rolling down the streets in Cadillacs. I saw a few out here today. I don't have a Cadillac, but then mine's not paid for either. There are a few swimming pools in rural America, and I'm glad to see it. I think with the type of farm legislation that George McGovern has helped enact in Congress, that we are receiving once again the recognition that is rightfully ours. And so I say to each and every one of you, men and women alike, rise up and assume your rightful place in the American economy today. Because it's still true, as true today as it was when Napoleon brought his army back from Moscow in those bad winter days. An army still travels on its stomach. And we all need what you till off the soil of the land here in rural America if the country is going to continue to grow and expand. And I hope that rural America will assert its rightful role in the nation's economy, in the nation's political machinations, in its social endeavor, in its artistic endeavor, as evidenced by the Johnson administration. So I hope that the next time somebody walks up to you and says, "You don't look like a farmer," that you feel like I do, that maybe it's worth blowing one once in a while to get it off your chest, because it's worth it to me, and I'm sure it must be worth it to you. I'm sure you've reached the very valid conclusion by now that no Brown County dirt farmer is a good substitute for George McGovern, but I appreciate your patience and the time, and I'm grateful to Mr. Radcliffe for the invitation. Thank you.
Our out-of-organization headliner, we call him. Each year we try to bring in somebody from outside of our organization to help headline our final day. And somehow or other we've always looked toward the Congress of the United States for our headliners. And over the years we have had many. But I don't recall that in recent years, oh yes, we had one from Minnesota a few years ago, who now is the Vice President of the United States. But we are fortunate tonight to have another young man from Minnesota who is on his way up in politics also. Alec Olson, who is a friend of many of ours here tonight, having been a friend before he gained the high seat in Congress that he has. I was born on a farm in Minnesota. And after graduation, he was actively engaged. Graduating from school, he was actually engaged in farming with his father until 1955, when he went into the insurance business. He was later promoted to district manager of the insurance company, and Farmers Union insurance, of course, is what it was that he was engaged in. A post he held until 1962, when he resigned to become a candidate for the United States Senate, or United States Congress, rather. Our speaker this evening served as district chairman of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota and was elected to Congress in 1962 on his first bid for public office. He won re-election again in 1964. He is the first congressional representative to serve the newly formed 19-county 6th district in Minnesota's agricultural heartland. The Minnesota congressman was assigned to the House Committee on Agriculture and to its subcommittees on dairy, livestock and feed grains, wheat and equipment, supplies and manpower. Currently the 12th in seniority on the Agriculture Committee, he has been named chairman of the Rural Development Subcommittee. Now, as I said, we are pleased and honored to have the congressman from Minnesota with us. He has been one of the leaders in the fight for the Good Farm Program, and my visiting with Senator McGovern a few days ago, the senator assured me that Congressman Alec Olson has been a leader in the fight for the Good Farm legislation, and we are especially pleased to have a congressman from our neighboring state here with us tonight. So, Congressman Olson, I introduce you to this fine group of South Dakota people.
Thank you very much, President Radcliffe. More fondly, I wish to refer to you as just plain Ben, as I do when you come to town so often to discuss the feeling or represent the voice of the South Dakota farmers. President Jim Patton, my very good friend for a long, long time, Reverend Miller, Mrs. Miller, Mayor Schmidt, Vice President Pease, and Mrs. Radcliffe. I felt as I was coming over here tonight that this would be a relatively simple task, if I should put it in such phraseology, to address you, because really I can't come before a Farmers Union audience without feeling quite at home. Not that in my many years of working in the vineyards, if that's what we can call the insurance business, that I had the privilege of addressing audiences such as the grand audience tonight, but I did become so familiar with Farmers Union friends, Farmers Union hospitality, that I just couldn't seem to make myself ill at ease at all. But when Ben became engaged in introductions tonight, it most assuredly reads like who's who, and I began to feel somewhat a bit skeptical about whom I were addressing. Then I stopped to think that, of course, we find leaders and friends wherever Farmers Union people are gathered. I want to bring you greetings from Senator McGovern from Washington, D.C. We're about wrapping the business of this Congress up, and he will be back with you in the weeks that lie ahead until the second session of the 89th Congress starts, and to thank you for helping, I know, send him to Washington, D.C. Such a friend of the family farmers has never been equaled before. He has a firm voice and a strong voice and a respected voice, and I appreciate very much being and considering myself a close friend of his and conferring with him often. I'd like tonight to make some remarks about agriculture. And I am also aware that I'm facing an audience who know as much about agriculture as I do, surely, who have spent many hours in these past few days concentrating on that subject here in a great convention. And I'm told that this is one of the largest crowds you've had in years. How fitting, how much joy it is for me to come home and frankly feel that we've made progress and to be greeted with such a large crowd and the information that it's one of the largest that has assembled in years. I think it's significant. I think you know what I'm going to say, and that's why you're here. But running the risk of being repetitive, I believe that this has been such a great legislative year in the Congress, and especially for the family farmers of our nation, South Dakota, Minnesota, and our nation, that let me briefly recite with you a chronological series or a chronology of the events since this Congress began in January of 1965. Jim, I recall some pessimism, to put it mildly, in January of 1965, some confusion. I must frankly admit to you that I did not cherish the fond hope of or thought of going home to my district, because they'd done a job on us, the columnists. They had everybody believing that this Congress was just going to sit down and behave like rubber stamps, because they were saying the administration didn't have a farm program. They weren't giving the Congress any credit for representing you. As I said, I admit that this took its toll as far as the reactions that we had. They were prejudging the 89th Congress. Maybe it can be rightfully said that the first effort to work over this administration was in agriculture. Things weren't bad enough, but I remember when they appointed an advisor in the White House to advise them on agricultural matters, and lo and behold, the appointee, a lawyer from Texas, I believe, responded to his appointment with the disastrous statement of acknowledging that he didn't know much about agriculture, but he was willing to learn. And about that time, we'd really had it. Still, I say to you that I could not become disheartened, because there had been no chance for the Congress to work its will. We knew we had a problem, we knew that we needed action, and we knew that talking about it or writing columns in the paper wasn't going to solve it. I responded to much of my mail by telling them that at best it was premature to judge the Congress in this area. We had work to do. We had 13 vacancies on the House Agriculture Committee. Nobody had even bothered to consider that they existed in the early months of 1965, that the legislative process hadn't been changed, and they were going to be called upon to set out their recommendations to the Congress and the Congress to the President. Of those vacancies, 11 of them were on the majority side. I had only served one term in the Congress. I never thought I'd be sitting on the top row. That is, there are 2 of them in the first term of the Congress. There were other people working. I have here with me, I picked up a packet out of my file on feed grains and wheat and farm legislation. And this statement begins with, "My name is Ben Radcliffe. I'm the president of South Dakota Farmers Union and a member of the executive committee," etc., etc. He was there to tell his story. We were beginning to work. We named and filled to the membership of that committee people who came to the Congress representing farmers. 5 new men from Iowa, and 2 of them got seats in the House Agriculture Committee. Banstra and Gregg, they know something about farming. They're good men. Redland from North Dakota, he knows about farming. He's a good man. Callan from Nebraska, Stahlbaum from Wisconsin, Foley from Washington. And President Jim Patton helped get him there. He told the administration that these voices that had been sent to Congress by farmers needed the opportunity to be heard. And indeed, we put together the best team that there's been in the House Agriculture Committee for years and years. I'm convinced of it. We had the tools to start work. We did start work. The administration Farm Bill was presented to us. It left something to be desired. No one had any illusions of what was going on, that the president had all the answers in agriculture, and he didn't tell anyone he had. He didn't try to foster those opinions. They sent up recommendations from the Department of Agriculture. It was a 2-year program. The wool program wasn't as good as we thought it could be, and we improved it. The rice was in and the cotton was out, and we threw the rice out and put the cotton in before we got done. We did work. Public relations were bad, but we had no rubber stamps, and we fully expected to make our views heard, and I say to you that we did make those views heard. Now, this farm bill that we've passed, and I don't want to elude anyone when I'm discussing it, is but a base and a good one. But I think that as any problem is to be met, to be worked on, any program is to be administered, we must know what we have, and we must accept what we have in order to make a better tomorrow. I'd like to briefly read to you the remarks I made on the floor of the House on the passage of the conference report on this tremendously significant Omnibus Farm Bill on Friday, October 8th, if you'll bear with me. And I, of course, put a little local emphasis in this as far as my own district, but I'm so close to you that I'm sure some of it spills over into South Dakota. No one can realistically believe that this Farm Bill has fully completed the requirements of those who produce the commodities which are affected. Since our criticisms of any such deficits will at this time serve no good purpose, I shall rather confine my remarks to the areas of progress. First, and very important, is the fact that this act adds to and extends our farm programs for 4 years. My colleagues who do not represent a farming area, I'm sure, cannot fully appreciate how significant this is. Last year, a large area of the district I represent suffered one of the most severe droughts in a quarter of a century. This year, only a few days ago, the same farmers lost as much as 60% of their crop because of a killing frost before maturity. I know I speak for the farmers of my district when I express appreciation for the 4-year farm program, thus removing the anticipation cost by not knowing what the immediate future might hold in the way of a farm program. In addition to income provided in the feed grains and wheat program, to pay operating costs for many producers in my district that might otherwise be unpaid, or an obligation that would merely increase because of interest costs, you notice that I specifically mention the payment of operating costs. These dollars are spent with the local businessmen who can better provide service to the community with dollars in their till than IOUs. This farm bill is not only important to the farmers and those who serve them directly, but it will play an important role in the health of our national economy. About 1/5 of the value of our trade is with other nations because of agricultural products. And I go on and end up saying that we have reduced farm surpluses since 1961 when many said it couldn't be done. Farm prices have increased every single month since that date. And we find today a situation where livestock prices are good, farm prices generally are on the upswing, and I conclude by saying it's difficult to imagine anyone being able to interpret this record as being adverse to the best interests of our farmers and our nation as a whole. Now, with this work and this bill, I sincerely want to thank you tonight for coming to Washington as part and supporting the fly-in. I think that South Dakota was about the second plane load to come to town. I know for a fact that it had its impression on the minds of my colleagues. I thank tonight Jim Patton and Ben Radcliffe and every single one of you because we did do a job. When we go back to January and consider the fact that people, even on the farms of America, who knew that the representatives they sent weren't going to sell them out, had a hopeless feeling, we went from that point to the point where we passed a farm bill with the most significant farm bill we've passed in at least 25 years, with the largest margin we've had for such a measure in 25 years. We did it in the House and we did it in the Senate. And indeed, I think this is a new day for agriculture. Oh, I think we've got much work to do. As I said, this is only a good base. But if you have a base, you can do some work. Here's a letter of April 8, 1965 that I addressed to Undersecretary of Agriculture John Snitker. It's my recommendations of how you might apply farm programs so that benefits more truly inure to family farmers. It can be done, President Christensen and President Radcliffe, and we're going to get the job done. We've got a program that's signed into law in a few days for 4 years that will allow us to concentrate on this kind of an effort. It was mentioned here tonight that I have a subcommittee chairmanship. The subcommittee is entitled Rural Development. I haven't had a meeting all year because we had to pass a farm bill. I believe that we had to do this job that was before us and required of urgency first. Next January, I'm going to have every guy in town who's got a buck to spend in agriculture up to that committee, Jim, and I'm going to ask them how they're spending it. We'll get to work in other areas. We've got much to do, so much to do that even if we didn't adjourn the Congress, we wouldn't run out of work. We've got some answers to find in rural America. We need a study of the problems of rural America. I think we're going to find some things out up there. I hear every single day about how the people leave the farms because of lack of opportunity, and they grant that is so, and come to the cities and go on the welfare rolls. I'm checking with the welfare department in Minneapolis right now in my office. I want them to produce for me the histories of those cases that are on welfare. And you know what I'll bet you money I'll find? That it's not the kids from Chippewa County, Montevideo, Minnesota, where I live 65 miles west of Watertown, that are on those welfare rolls. They replace somebody. We educated them. We educate them so well that the taxes in Montevideo are twice as high as they are where I live in Alexandria, Virginia. We don't send poorly educated people who haven't got the best kind of training to seek and take advantage of the opportunities that are provided in our society from the heartland of America. Oh no, I think we give them the best most often. And I think we ought to be given credit for giving the best. I think we need to concentrate on the opportunities that we can put back in rural America not to lose this valuable asset. Yes, we've got work to do. And I know that we're going to do that job with the cooperation of people like you who are assembled here tonight. We're not going to quit. We've just begun. We have programs and goals in this nation that are not yet even fully appreciated in this day and age. The poverty program. I'm asked to speak on it almost in every community in my district when I come home. They want to know what it is. Maybe you want to know what it is. You know what I tell them? I don't know. Yes, I voted for it because I had the courage to vote for an idea. I had the knowledge that we can't go along in this great society, and I don't think it's just a label, it's a fact. Never has a people been so blessed with so much before in the history of the world. But I don't think that we can forget about the bottom end here and let the people on the top end continually go on and on and on in the benefits that they can negotiate for themselves and they've taken care of for themselves. Here comes the farm programs. Here comes the interest in those who do not have educational opportunities to seek the benefits of our society. You don't have to worry about the steelworkers. You don't even have to worry about the politicians. There are those in this society in great proportion or in great majority that will take care of the needs that they have. And we must not let those in the small numbers be left to halt our society, because that's what they will do. So we've got lots to do. We need imaginative thinking. We need to apply ourselves and let ourselves be applied to these problems. And I want to just close tonight by reminding you that when you are too bamboozled about what's gone on in Congress, sit down and let yourself ponder it a bit. There's nothing happened in the 89th Congress that you're not responsible for. Think it over. Lyndon Baines Johnson, President of the United States, is a man whom I respect beyond description because he has the ability to lead. He has the courage to lead. But the programs are passed with the people you sent down in the Congress to support them. They're your ideas. I think that all we have to do is pause sometimes between the commentary that we read in the paper and stop to consider that the President himself tried to tell you when he went to Kansas City, Missouri to sign the Medicare bill. He told you in no uncertain terms that President Truman was for it, that Adlai Stevenson was for it, that John F. Kennedy was for it, and he's for it, and you people sent people to the Congress because you were for it. I hope that's not regarded as a partisan remark. I don't mean it to be. We've made progress, and we don't intend to be partisan. We haven't got room to do more than have a little fun about that once in a while in this country. We need to stand for programs and support programs that are going to promote the welfare, and that's best promoted at home. The poverty program, again, is an illustration. We have decided that we will take the chance, because it's never been proven that it's wrong before in the history of this country, to be partners and to assist in the development of local communities. A few dollars. Some people who know how to make out an application or can get assistance to do it. And then we ask you for the ideas. Like we do in the Farm Bill. We ask you for the ideas. We ask your guidance. That's the way America has responded and made itself the greatest nation on the face of the earth. Through your initiative, that's just exactly what we're doing now. I'm very, very happy to be with you tonight. I want to express my great appreciation. As I say, I'm a close neighbor to South Dakota, and I used to sneak across the line once in a while, probably work with fellows that had a Minnesota address or a South Dakota address. I border you immediately to the east. I feel that there's some common identity, and certainly I always feel that wherever I may go with the Farmers Union, there is a strong bond of identity. And I again say to you that you have a great organization, one that my admiration for is unceasing. And really, I suppose that comes from being born and raised almost in the Farmers Union. I've seen you back up with leaders the ideas for a better America. You've done a great job. We've made great progress together this year. I thank you very much.
When we have an opportunity to be addressed by President Jim Patton, who certainly needs no introduction to this group, let me say only that Jim, in his 2 decades of leadership on the farm front, has become recognized not only as the leader of Farmers Union, but the Dean of Agriculture, the leader in agriculture, not only nationally, but internationally. And we're so pleased, Jim, that you're able to come out and be with us year after year, that we just don't know how to express it. So I'll say it is my pleasure to introduce our great national president, Jim Patton.
Your very generous introduction. President and Mrs. Radcliffe, my dear friend and co-worker, Congressman Alec Olson, Mayor and Mrs. Schmidt, Vice President and Mrs. Herman Peets, Reverend and Mrs. Miller, and my hundreds of friends who are assembled here, and those who may be listening in tonight. I got a terrific thrill out of hearing this wonderful young man whom you've just heard. He is ours. We grew him. The Farmers Union grew him, and he worked in the Farmers Union. And you don't have to go down and organize Alec Olson to get him to accept the Farmers Union idea, because he's just as strong for it as you are, and he has some very good ideas of his own. So we're extremely proud of the identification, Alex, with you, beyond the splendid service that you are rendering in the very intelligent way you are doing it. Naturally, I don't want to never do come to a state without paying my respect to a few of the people who make up your great state. First, I'm very proud that I'm in the state where the Vice President of the United States, one of the greatest statesmen we have in the world today, Hubert Humphrey, comes from. And I walked over and made a purchase at the Humphrey drugstore, and I'm going to tell Hubert about it the next time I see him. And then George McGovern, I know that you people in the Farmers Union appreciate George McGovern, but I doubt that many people in the state of South Dakota and this nation fully appreciate George McGovern for what he stands for. George McGovern is one of the most daring, fearless leaders in the fight for world peace in the Senate of the United States. He is not he is not afraid to stand up and constructively criticize the President of the United States. He is not afraid to take an opposite position. I was in the balcony one day of the Senate when he introduced a resolution, or rather an amendment, to an appropriation bill to cut $2 billion off of the defense bill. And he had one vote besides himself. A few weeks later, he had 17 votes. But that's the kind of a man you have in George McGovern. He thinks in terms of peace. He thinks in terms of using food for peace. He thinks of the people all the time, and he has the kind of courage and militancy that is going to make him, I think, not only one of the great world leaders for peace, but also the new George Norris of our modern day, because he has taken so much interest in resources as well as food. And then you have another one engaged whom you can be very proud of in the field of resources and resource development, Ken Holum, who is the Assistant Secretary of Interior. And then you have our own Ray Fitzgerald, who came right out of the Farmers Union, as did Ken Holum, who is doing a great job in the farmer elected committee system. And I want to pay my respect then to our own state people, my dear friend and co-worker Ben Radcliffe, who's doing a grand job on the national scene and is indeed one of the real leaders and one of the growing leaders in this movement. And to Arlene Sly and Cliff Ott, who is a great builder of our insurances, and to those of you who have become interested in what I think will become a more and more important part of the program of the Farmers Union, namely the senior citizens' work. And I hope that you saw our drug display, our mail-order drug display back there, which is one of the new services that we have instituted, particularly for senior citizens, to save money on prescription drugs where they have to take costly or expensive prescription drugs continuously or daily, so to speak. I was glad to hear Congressman Olson say that this was not a rubber stamp Congress. I was unpopular for a few weeks over around both the White House and the Department of Agriculture. At the time, the agricultural bill of the administration was sent to the Hill, because I said publicly, repeatedly, that it was not enough and that we were going to get more. And Alec Olson and many more, including George McGovern of your own state and others, were not rubber stamps. They went farther and did more things and did different things than the administration called for. The administration frequently expects and wants people to go farther than they think they can go. Roosevelt used to tell me, he said, well, Jim, if you can get the votes, I'll be with you, and I'll go ahead and call for it. I recall very well when I went in to see him about the whole idea of the Valley authorities, the extension of the Valley Authority to the Missouri, which was gradually becoming a reality, although it had to go through a shotgun wedding of the Pick-Sloan plan in order to eventually become a Valley Authority concept. And President Roosevelt said, Jim, I believe very much in the idea, get me enough votes and we'll go ahead and push. And he said, I'll take the lead the minute I think there's somewhere near enough votes, and I'm not asking people like you to get them. But that's what we have to do in order to, always have to ask for more than the government is willing to give. And then we have to deal with that institution who's known as the Budget Bureau. Now they're a representative of the President of the United States. They are part of his staff. And they are hard-nosed, pencil-pushing economists who know very little about farming, but who know a lot about the so-called CPA approach to family agriculture. And they're always wanting to nickel and dime us to death. And I congratulate this Congress congratulate Congressman Olson and all of the others for the wonderful job they did in going beyond what the government asked for. I don't mind pressuring the President of the United States. I don't mind pressuring Congress. I don't mind asking for more, and I'm going to make them feel that I'm very unhappy, just as long as I don't go too far with my friends, because that's the way you get things done. You don't get it done by being a nice guy all the time and just say we'd go along with whatever you want. We say to our friends like Alec Olson, for example, get as much as you can for us, and we're going to help you get reelected this next time. Now, I would like to dwell for a little while this evening on how legislation gets passed. This farm bill was not the creation of either the administration or the Congress of this time. It was a long-felt dream, and many of the things that are in it are things that have been talked about for many, many years. The purpose of the Farmers Union is to be, it has to be, first, a minority organization, because if it ever becomes a majority organization, it will no longer be a leader of thought and thinking. The purpose of an organization like the Farmers Union is to create and sell ideas that are not acceptable in the beginning, but are in time acceptable. In March of 1949, when Sid Pace was the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, we went up 2 or 3 days before the Secretary of 2 or 3 days after the Secretary of Agriculture, the then Charles Brannan, and presented 2 ideas which I want to talk about a little tonight. One was the idea of a family farm cutoff and a limitation. The other, and tied with production payments based on units. We used 5,000 bushels of wheat at that time as the number of units for a family farm, with a cutoff of no more payments above that, direct payments, setting the loan rate at the world price level and interpreting those units, those 5,000 units, into pigs, chickens, corn, wheat, or cotton, or whatever else you want to interpret it, and every farmer had a right to grow that much and receive production payments up to 100% of parity of income. That was in 1949. In 1949, at the same time, we presented a plan for a nationwide system of cooperatives for the purpose of gaining bargaining power. We almost made it with the Brannan plan. We were getting steam underway, well underway, in 1950, when a very unfortunate tragedy occurred in the world, namely the Korean War broke out. The prices of farm products began to go up, and the Brannan plan went out the window. It never had a real chance then, because agricultural prices went up and stayed somewhat above parity or at parity all through the Korean War period, and didn't start to drop below parity until around mid-1953. Now, how is a bill passed? First, it has to become an idea, a dream, something new. It has to become a dream or an idea in an organization or a man's head, and he begins, or they begin, to sell that idea. It has to be sold to a great many people. First, it has to be sold to the leaders of the government in power. It has to be sold to a number of congressmen. But before it can be sold to a number of congressmen, it must have rather wide acceptance by a group of people. The way we really got the Farm Bill and the way we've really gotten farm legislation for the last 14 years is because people like the Farmers Union, and especially the Farmers Union, has maintained good relationships with organized labor in this country. And I want to thank the delegates to this convention for passing a resolution calling for the repeal of the Taft-Hartley 14B. 14B is the greatest offender to labor that we can have. And no legislation that I know of, farm legislation, in the last 15 years has passed without the city congressman, and the Democratic city congressmen are usually elected by the minorities and the labor vote. The Farmers Union, in addition to that, worked with the church groups. We have an organization called the National Council on Agricultural Life and Labor. And we were principally engaged in two things. One in the preservation of the family farm, and the other in the elimination of bracero or Mexican national labor coming in. And in that group we had everybody from city people, preachers, priests, rabbis, all kinds of religious people. We had the Sharecropper Society. We had some elements of organized labor. And then in addition to that, of course, we had the ECIC, the Electric Consumers Information Conference. And that was organized primarily by the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association and the National Farmers Union. And they jumped in. And then we had the National Wheat Growers Association, and they jumped in. We had the Grange, and they jumped in and helped. We had the senior citizens, and let me tell you how potent they are. It was not this session of Congress, but the session of Congress before this, that the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, who was a very good friend of mine, decided that he was not going to vote out the food stamp plan bill. And another congressman from a very powerful one, who has something to do with appropriations, told the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee that he wouldn't get his experimental tobacco research station unless the food stamp plan bill was passed out of the committee, and as I recall it, it was passed out in 2 days after that. Medicare, people who were interested in Medicare joined up in the passage of the Farm Bill, and so on around. In America today, what is good for all America is good for any segment of America. But it is not necessarily true that what some group thinks is good for them is good for all of America. But the day is past, ladies and gentlemen, when you're going to get farm legislation, when you're going to get labor legislation, when business is going to get legislation, just by itself, by having powerfully paid lobbies. We are engaged in a social revolution, the like of which this country and probably no other country has seen, which is not a violent revolution. The city congressmen, the church groups, the men of goodwill, and many others helped in the passage not only of the Farm Bill, but in the greatest array of social legislation passed by any Congress in the history of the United States. Medicare, aid to higher education, federal aid to education, ideas that some of us have been preaching for as many as 20 years. And I could go on and on. One of the most important farm bills that was passed was one which was almost passed in a unanimous way by the leadership of Senator Aiken of Vermont in the Senate and the leadership of Bob Pogue in the House. That was a bill to provide water loans for building water and sewage facilities for towns of 5,500 or less. And that means that those water lines can be extended out, and I would say next to REA in terms of benefiting all rural people. That is one of the most important pieces of legislation passed in a great period of time. A lot of people have said to me, well, why am I interested in Medicare? Well, let me tell you, 48% of the poverty in this country is in rural America, in spite of the fact that less than 30% of the population is in rural America. Medicare to me means that there is income just the same as if it were in the form of price supports, because it means that some family will not have to take out of their pocket money to buy for medical or rather for hospital care and certain other care that they need to educate their kids or otherwise. In the state of Arkansas this year, we have 11,000 young people. We had 11,000 young people who were paid $6 million under the Youth Corps program for helping in city offices and in schools and in roads and helping in public places to do work that otherwise wouldn't have been done. Now, while I am a very staunch supporter for even a higher income, and I'm not satisfied with the income level of the American farmer, I submit to you that in Arkansas, the payment of $6 million to 11,000 school kids was better, Congressman Olson, than having passed a higher price support on cotton. Because if my guess is right, about 10,000 big mules in Arkansas would have gotten all the money, and the little fellows, the little farmers, would have gotten very little of it in that particular instance. That to me is farm income. I interviewed some of these people. I interviewed people in Arkansas. You know what they told me, what the kids told me? In every instance they said, we're going to buy school books, because there they have to buy their school books. In most instances they said, we're going to buy clothes because we don't have enough clothes. In some instances they said they were going to buy clothes for their sisters and their brothers. In other instances they said that they were going to help their family who were in need, because all of these people were people who had to be, in order to get on the roll, and that particular work, the work that we were doing, had to be people who came from low-income families. All of these things put together have made for a great Congress. A great agricultural bill with great benchmarks has been passed. Several important principles have been there, and I can't fail to say that if it had not been for a great Congress, such as the young man you've just listened to, a great President of the United States who really believes deeply in the little fellow and in agriculture and the family farm, a great Secretary of Agriculture, and educational and operational agencies such as the ASCS, the Farmer Elected Committees, the Farmers Home Administration, REA, and many others, we would not have had this important legislation. To me, the four-year program, the fact that the program is a four-year program, gives us time to figure out the new things that we've got to do in agriculture, because we have a revolution going on. And I'm more deeply concerned about a rural America. It gives us a chance to increase and improve the whole theory of direct income payments. It has another very great implication, which many of you will be interested in. In addition to leading us eventually toward some kind of a family farm cutoff, and I happen to believe that you ought to license farmers directly and forget all of this stuff to try and manipulate. It leads us to the point at which the bill directs that the Secretary of Agriculture must eventually define what a family farm is. I believe that it leads us eventually to say that we have four groups in agriculture. We have this group here, which is relatively small in number, it's large in terms of its position, who have incomes that are too low to be family farmers. And they're scattered all over America. They're not just in the South. And they are people who cannot be helped very much. They can some by price supports. What they need is re-education. What they need is to move factories into places like Huron and elsewhere where they can get new kinds of jobs, but they shouldn't be moved into the cities of America, because it is 1,000 Negroes a month who move into the city of Los Angeles who help to make Watts possible. And you watch and see, Chicago is going to be in shambles one of these days for the very same reason, for the poor Negroes and the poor whites who moved off mainly of the farms of the South, some of them from southern Illinois. Let's keep them out there on the land. Let's work out ways and means of seeing that our people have an opportunity to live in rural America. I'm glad that a leader like Alec Olson is in charge of rural development, because you're going to see so many changes in rural America that you won't even recognize it if you're living 20 years from now. We're only in the midst, we're only in the beginning of a mechanical and industrial revolution. We're only in the beginning of the process where we're going to bring back, in my opinion, to rural America thousands upon thousands of people, not necessarily to farm. I'm not going to get into the numbers game, but I believe that now is the time when America must decide what kind of an America she wants to be, because for the first time in the history of the world, this nation has the privilege of deciding what kind and can be whatever kind of an America she wants to be. Does she want to be an America controlled by a few corporate minorities and a 1984 with a two-class society, a few computer machines and cybernated operations where everybody else are plebeians and get all they want to eat and get beer on Saturday night if they want it, but are not let in to anything, where history is rewritten every time it needs to be? The George Orwell world of 1984 is what I'm describing. Or do we want a beautiful America in which we redefine work, in which we have assure everyone that they have enough income that they will be able to wear and use up their fair share of this nation's income, and have a level below which they do not need to go, but above which their energy, their drive, and their ability can lead them? This leads me to what kind of a rural America? As I said before, I think the number one thing is to describe these various segments. We know that we have 48% of the poverty in the first section I described, and we know we have a smaller corridor of people who are teetering on the edge like this. They can become family farmers if you do enough through FHA, if you apply some of the ASC and conservation programs more heavily to them, if you grade them so that they get more of the total pie to help them along, they can become family farmers, especially many of our younger farmers. And then you have this great middle section, which are the commercial family farmers. And I would put a farm cutoff on that. I would license farmers in that field, and I would assure them full parity of income for their production, and assure them enough income that they can pay for the depletion. The difference between their outgo and their income in the last 10 years has been at the rate of $2.9 billion per year. In other words, they've spent $2.9 billion more per year than they have taken in. Where did it come from? Well, I'll tell you where it came from. It came from the inflated value or inflated price of land and the ability of the farmers to borrow the money from various lending agencies to go on and on farming. And it didn't come out of it came out, of course, depreciating machinery and all of the other things, but it came out primarily of the inflated values of land, which in many instances arose out of the speculation in land by people who shouldn't own land. I personally do not believe that any person who does not intend to farmland should be allowed to own farmland. I believe that they should be like Sweden, that they should be required to live on that land and farm it. And that is not, in my opinion, radical doctrine, but it's very conservative doctrine. We have before us a new world, a new society to build. The inbox, and farmers don't know office terms, but we have two boxes on our desk, whether we're executives or junior executives or just people that work at a desk. On the left-hand side usually is called the inbox, and that's all the incoming things, the mail and things that remain undone that you work on. And over on this side is the outbox. The problem we have facing us now is that the inbox is practically empty. The President of the United States, President Kennedy, and President Johnson, along with this Congress, have practically emptied the inbox. We're looking and needing new ideas. We're looking and needing for new applications. And we farmers especially, and we farm organizations especially, must come up with new ideas. We must accept that this is 1965, that a great social revolution is going on, and whether we take part in it or don't take part in it will decide whether or not we're going to be an important part in the future. I went through the tragedy of the early 30s in the Farmers Union, and at that time there was a great New Deal coming in. And there were only 800 county agents in the United States. The farmers had driven most of the county agents out or kicked them out because they had to pay taxes to keep them in. Whether they were good or bad, they just drove them out. And we were invited in, the Farmers Union was invited in to help put together the New Deal farm program. But we went down to the railroad station and we couldn't make up our mind to get on, so we had an Irish picnic. Now you Swedes don't understand what an Irish picnic is, but that's where every Irishman grabs a shillelagh and hits the first Irishman he can see, whether he knows him or not. We decided to battle for 7 years, or 8 years. In the meantime, the American Farm Bureau Federation, that very cagey and very gentlemanly old man, I think he's dead now maybe, Edward A. O'Neill and Earl Smith of Illinois, were smart enough to go to Henry Wallace and say, yes, we'll help you rebuild rural America. We'll help you rebuild a busted rural America. And for that, you must help us build the Farm Bureau. And so they had outside the county AAA office a man with a receipt book in practically every county in the United States. And they told him, in effect, they told the farmer, in effect, when he came to get his AAA check, that part of it was a deduction for his dues in the Farm Bureau, and that was the way the Farm Bureau was built. In the meantime, we had a jolly well old time, and by 1937, we began to get started on the road. What I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, don't take lightly these new programs. Don't take lightly poverty. It must be eradicated in America. A country that has an income of $650 billion, a country that can spend $50 billion a year to destroy other people, a country that can spend $23 billion in 5 years to send a man to the moon for God knows, I don't know what, the scientists haven't been able to tell me, but let's go ahead and send them. A country that can do all of these things can eradicate poverty from its midst without either going socialistic or otherwise. A country that can do all of these things can take care of its senior citizens. It can see that they have a market basket social security because they didn't get enough income as they went through life. And speaking of that, we farmers have exported over $700 billion of young people to the cities of America. Trained, as you said, Alec, some of them better than others, but we sent over $700 billion of young people to the cities of America to help capitalize those cities. And the surveys made not very long ago showed that many of the senior executives of our top companies came from the rural areas of America. The Farmers Union itself must not overlook the fact that there's a great opportunity in this community development program. You need hospitals, you need nursing homes, you need all sorts of things that can be built if you will take some imagination and go to the Office of Economic Opportunity. That's the reason I set up the Community Development Program. And we're training over at the University of Wisconsin right now 45 young men who will become experts, not in telling a community what to do, but in helping a community to plan, to do what it wants to do. If it feels that its first priority is a nursing home, or a senior citizen's home, or maybe a new system for water or sewage, then these young men will be technicians who will be able to help them put all the blue and red and green and yellow tape together that it requires to get some money out of Washington. But it's here. It's going to be here. There are going to be other programs. We ought to be right in the middle of pushing these new programs. We ought to be right in the middle of creating a total rural America. We can no longer go on as a farm organization, and I'm not going to speak to anybody else tonight. We cannot go on as a farm organization thinking we can play exclusively, because the merchant on Main Street, and that was one of the geniuses, Ben, of your fly-in, the merchant on Main Street, the clergyman on Main Street, the professional man on Main Street has a stake in us, and we have a stake in him. God save the day when America may become a place where we'll be piled up in concrete blockhouses around the periphery of America in this great, beautiful hinterland, so to speak, using the city man's term. It's a vacant place with a few railroad stops and a few great corporate farms to produce the stuff. As a matter of fact, we may not even need the farms for that purpose. But let's beautify America Let's rebuild rural America. Let's recapitalize it. It has been decapitalized. And we in the Farmers Union must be prepared to make changes. And I have some specific suggestions, and I'm going to close with them. First, I believe that we have to take a completely new look at the way we finance the Farmers Union. The Farmers Union educational organization, like most educational organizations, is always broke. It never has enough money. A farmer doesn't think anything of putting in money to buy a new tractor if he has it, and he'll pay, and he never squawks or seldom squawks. He can't do anything about it if he wanted to, about what the price of that tractor is. If he has the money, he goes to town and buys a new automobile, which is perfectly his business and all right. And if they've raised the price $35, $50, or $100, he either doesn't say anything about it, but if he does say anything about it, the dealer says, I can't help it, that's the price tag they put on it. But when you talk to him about raising the dues, why, we have always been a bunch of penny pinchers. There are probably some of you in this room who pay automatic checkoff to the American Dairy Association. The farmers pay $85 billion a year to fill the American stomach with turkey, with cranberries, with butter, with milk, with everything else. But they never stop to think that the human stomach can only hold 4 pounds, and if you get 4 pounds of beef in it, how in the world are you going to put any turkey in, or any milk, or any bread, or anything else? Now, I'm not against these promotional schemes, but you'll put good money into those things, $85 million worth, and go along, crippling along on $5 or $7 or $8 dues. The answer is somewhere in the European system. And I propose that someday the Farmers Union, if it survives, will move along these lines. First, that it recognize that the cooperatives, both the supply, the merchandising, and so on, and I'll have a little more to say later about cooperatives, be the bargaining agent for the farmer in relation to his purchases and his marketing. Secondly, that the cooperative organizations get out of the business of trying to influence legislation and depend upon the Farmers Union to do its legislative work, and that they put enough money, which is the farmers' money, into the General Farm Organization to finance it like it should be financed, to make the kind of fight it's going to have to make in the future. Every patron of every Farmers Union cooperative automatically should become a member of the Farmers Union. We should do away with the checkoff and the educational funds and just point off a decimal point on the business done by our regional cooperatives, and both in supplies and marketing and processing, and say to ourselves, this is what is going to be paid to each state on the basis of their patronage. It would work something like this. You'd add a fraction of a % on purchases of supplies. We've done this in one state, and it worked beautifully. We had one fellow who paid $3,000 a year dues. In England, they have over 4,000 farmers who pay over $3,000 a year dues. In the field of marketing and processing, we would just point off a certain figure which would be agreed upon on a 10-year contract, and the co-ops would get out of the General Farm Organization business, and the General Farm Organization would get out of business and turn it all over to the co-ops. But we must have a family meeting. We must have a coming together on this concept. Furthermore, the General Farm Organization, the Farmers Union specifically, must become a rural organization. It must take an interest in the total community, not just the schools, but what is going on in town. It must take an interest, a deep interest in politics, and express its view, whether your politics are Republican or John Birchite or Democratic. You should express your view and become a vocal person, an educated person in that respect. The Farmers Union has to find some better answers legislatively than we now have for farm programs. I predict, because I can afford to, I won't be around here very long, and they can't kick me around very long, I predict that we have passed the last General Farm Organization commodity bill. The day of the commodity approach per se is pretty well over. In the main, the commodity groups are nothing but a normal group of business people, you would call them, who try to clobber the Secretary of Agriculture and the Congress into getting as much for their particular commodity as they can get. They do not look upon themselves as human beings. They do not think of the total community. They think only in terms of their commodity. And we do not grow commodities for the purpose of growing commodities. The only purpose of growing commodities is to have something to feed our kids, raise our kids, give them a decent education, and be honorable citizens. And there is a broader and better way to do it. We've got to get more, we've got to depend more and more of getting our money for our products out of the marketing place through the strengthening of the bargaining power of our cooperatives. Therefore, I propose that the Secretary of Agriculture make a study, be instructed to make a study, and that we propose, along with organized labor, that the Congress of the United States appropriate $5 billion to put together a nationwide system of marketing, purchasing, processing, and retail distribution, chain store distribution co-ops to control 25% of the product. I don't believe that the co-op should have a monopoly. But if we control 25% of any product, then we'll begin to have a lot of bargaining power in the marketplace, and we won't have to depend on anyone else. Do the steel workers have to come to the Congress of the United States to get a raise? No, they have the bargaining power. Do the automobile manufacturers have to come to the Congress of the United States to get a raise in the price of automobiles? No, they have the bargaining power. Do the auto workers have to come to the Congress of the United States to get a raise? No, they have the bargaining power. Do the farm machinery manufacturers have to come to the Congress of the United States to get a raise? No, they have the bargaining power. It's only the little guy out at the end of the line who may sell that Chevrolet or Ford or whatever it may be, and he may take a discount or cut off some of his commission or give you a long price for your worn-out floozy in order to make the sale, but he's the one that takes the rap. The central institution doesn't. Now, I have no complaint about that as long as it's reasonable, but the farmers of this country are kidding themselves if they think that they're going to get away very much longer by tapping the public till for getting the prices for their commodities. I propose, secondly, that the Secretary of Agriculture be asked immediately, and I hereby ask him to do what the Congress asked him to do, to make a survey of what a family farm is, and to cite and name the family farms in every county in the United States. And then the Congress should take the proper legislation to see that that family farm is protected. I am a very strong believer that we in the future will see three basic things happen. One, that we'll see an inflow into rural America, that the reverse of the outflow will be stopped, and that people will live in rural America whether they're farmers or not. We'll have whatever number of farmers we need, and they'll be family farmers. And I'm not arguing about price, because if it takes $3 a bushel for wheat to have a family farm, then I'm for paying the $3 a bushel for wheat and setting up the bargaining power for getting it. But we've got to get off our duffs. We've got to get going and be able to make some changes, to consolidate our cooperatives in many instances, to federate with others in the farm organization field, to find new ways of building a stronger and better farmers' union, and take care of those things at home, the elimination of poverty, moving industry into rural America wherever it can. The president of Camel Soup said the other day in a speech before some industrial group that the policy of his company was to move a reasonable number of their plants, not just their canning plants, but their manufacturing plants, the tin-making plants and so on, into strictly rural areas. And thus far, it had been a great success. I think that the Farmers Union domestically has to become a rural organization, not a farmers' organization. It has to take its role along with the other leaders of the community. It has to find ways of training and plowing up new leaders with new concepts, a concept that will give freedom. In the international field, there is never a surplus and never was a surplus as long as there was an empty belly. And there isn't any surplus today. As a matter of fact, even on a domestic basis, we're tremendously close to shortages in some fields. For a while, the Secretary of Agriculture had to cut off the dry skim milk that was going to foreign countries through the voluntary agencies such as the church agencies and CARE because there wasn't enough dry skim milk. We're living in the age of abundance, so therefore we should not consider food and surpluses as something to be disposed of. We should use our food along with the other countries of the world who are the so-called surplus producers to move, if you please, to filling the empty bellies, but more importantly, to use that food as capital to help those countries to help themselves, because we could produce all of the food we wanted in the United States and Australia, New Zealand, the European countries, and Japan, and we couldn't possibly feed. We've lost, as John Eklund said today, we're losing every day. The number of calories available to the people of the world is smaller every day. It's less today than it was at the end of World War I. We're in a race in which a time bomb is sitting at our feet every minute we run that race. The time bomb, not of nuclear explosion, the time bomb, if you please, where the end of a sufficient food supply and the population come together head on. And goodness knows what will happen then. We will not only have starvation, but we will have wars, revolutions, such as we have never seen, and movements of people such as we have never seen. It is time, my friends, for us to look up to new vistas, to recognize that this great country of ours is now in the age of abundance. When I talk to some people about the right to have an income, whether they work or not, I'm talking about something that isn't new. It's recognized in the income tax of America. It's been recognized for a long, long time. But what I'm really saying is not that. What I'm really saying is that we should put a floor under every person below which they do not need to sink, so that we can wipe out the bureaucracy of the vested interests of the welfare agencies that run clear across this country, and so that every man can hold his head high with some dignity, so that he can rise above that, so that we can have a quality of education. And in closing, we must build a quality America. We must build a quality rural America. We can't have the rural slums that we have, the shacks, the hundreds of thousands of millions of shacks. A very high percentage of the rural homes of this country, and they're scattered all over this nation, they aren't just in the South, are homes that are really not up to the standard of a modern America. There are needs for hundreds of thousands of doctors, and I suppose maybe 1 million more nurses, and all sorts of people. The greatest resource we have is people, but we must up the quality of education, we must up the quality of opportunity, and we must up the quality of living. And as we do that, as the Pope said, we are all God's children, and one day we'll find a way of living together in peace. The great thing that Pope Paul or Pope John did was to make it respectable to discuss peace in America, because the Russians had stolen from us the privilege to discuss peace. And anyone who talked about peace was considered either a socialist, a left-winger, or an out-and-out communist. But Pope John made it respectable in his great encyclical called Pacem in Terris. And then the great historic visit of the Pope and his visit with the other great religious leaders of this country and the visiting of the United Nations gives us even greater hope that the people of the world will recognize that there is only one mankind, that we are all God's children, and that to have anything to move forward, we must live at peace with each other. Thank you.